the world's first electronic computer.
In 1 second, the computer can perform more than 1 million arithmetical operations.
Advanced microprocessors like the 286 or the 386.
Potential Y2K computer crashes top the list.
And we are calling it iPhone.
It's part of a popular movement in the technology industry. It's called cloud computing.
And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Hello, and welcome to Magnetic, the history of computing. This is episode 2, In the Beginning. I'm going to do you a huge favor and skip over a couple of thousand years of history leading up to why we have arrived here, in this age where computing is part of the infrastructure of our lives, as important as electricity or plumbing. This is a time where computers are everywhere, in every aspect of our lives, and we can no longer escape them. Though I don't think we'd want to because they do so much for us. But how we got here is a result of several major discoveries that I'll briefly highlight on this episode. For a little background, I encourage you to watch an excellent show called Connections by James Burke. A particular episode called Faith in Numbers is available on archive.org. James Burke takes you through an interesting series of events that led to modern computers, starting with Roman aqueducts and ending up with GPS systems. It's pretty fascinating and influenced my understanding of history when it comes to computers. He just makes it all make sense. What I'll do today is put some things together that contributed to modern-day computing, the abacus, linen, and rugs. Just stay with me on this. I promise it'll be worth your time. So we start with the abacus, which is first created in Sumeria at around 2700 BC. I can almost guarantee you've seen one in your life. It's that square with wires that makes columns. It's got beads along those wires, and the whole thing is split up in the middle by another wooden piece, kind of making it into two rectangles. The top represented 5, or 4 depending on which one you use, and the bottom represented 1 through 5. Each of the columns were like number sets, ones, tens, hundreds, etc., and the whole thing was great for counting along as you go. So it wasn't advanced in technology. What it did was it made counting easier, and that's good. The next thing that was so important to computing was linen. Linen back in the 15th century was being used by everyone, especially in those frilly undergarments that the ladies used to wear. Apparently, those would be worn so much that they wore out and eventually had to be just tossed out. The plague had spread through all of Europe in the 15th century, wiping out a huge population of people. There were, in fact, so many deaths every day that some found full-time employment as a new job called a bone collector. Bone collector was a busy guy, and if he survived the plague, he had a pretty steady job. Until the plague ended, that is. Thank goodness the plague stopped, but by the time the guy who used to be the bone collector now became a guy who was out of work. However, he quickly started pulling a sort of double duty to keep that job because he had a new task called the linen collector. The linen collector, formerly the bone collector and survivor of the plague, started gathering linens and taking them to paper manufacturers. That's right, I said paper. You see, the amazing part about linen is that someone discovered it could be shredded, beaten for a couple of days with big heavy hammers, dried, and formed into large sheets of paper. This paper was used to print books, announcements, and whatever else someone with some money decided to put on them. This was one of the things that launched paper into popularity, along with another invention, Gutenberg's printing press, which found an easier way to print on paper. But it doesn't fall into the development of computers, so I'll let you read about that on your own if you're so inclined. So where are we now? We have people who have an interest in keeping track of numbers and counting. We have the invention of paper from recycled linens, so what's next? Automation. Automation, which, believe it or not, has been around for centuries. And it has come in forms of a cylinder with raised teeth that moved steel pins or wood pins, making them operate in a certain way. Are you familiar with a music box? That's exactly where the concept came from. And that technology has actually been around since the 9th century. It has been used in a variety of ways, such as a church bell ringer, hammer activator for the paper I talked about earlier, and, of course, the music boxes. Fast forward to 1804. People of high society have clothing with beautiful, intricate patterns on them, which have been around for centuries. To make those, you used what's called a draw loom, where you had two people working, one who controlled the thread and material, and the other who controlled the pattern, called a draw boy. This was a very slow process, but it had beautiful results. Someone named Basile Bouchon thought that they would help out with operations by putting in a perforated band of paper. The perforations were punched by hand and the roll itself was installed, but this wasn't the best solution. The punches were found to have errors and the paper warped before making it all the way through the pattern they were producing. Enter Joseph Marie Jacquard, who saw this process and recognized that it too was a slow one. For Jacquard, weaving was a family business and one he was always around. He was never trained in weaving, but being a curious guy, he was always playing with ways for how to do the job better. He was kind of like a Six Sigma black belt of the weaving industry, I guess you could say. Jacquard saw patterns of work in the cards the draw boys would use. He decided to create punch cards out of wood that would be placed together in a line to create the same pattern on the material. Punch cards were created by an old typewriter-looking machine called a punch, and those cards were placed on the loom machine, eliminating the need for that draw boy. I guess being replaced by automation in a job is not new. Sorry, draw boy. The government of France loved the idea and the loom took off, making Jacquard famous and rich. So, we have a counting machine, the Abacus, good paper, and as much of it as we could dream of, and punch cards that we can make out of the paper. With electricity being around for a while but not yet harnessed, all we need is a couple more steps and voila! See where I'm going? I'm getting ahead of myself, and we'll address these last few steps in the next episode when we talk about a guy named Babbage who put it all together and a new thing that America's 16th president was gaga for. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next leg of the journey.